In Chapter 9, we're going to talk about some of the ins and outs of conducting experiments in terms of how we manipulate the variable. We're going to spend a lot of time on that, but there are a lot of considerations in how we conduct an experiment, and there are some pros and cons to them. So let's jump into the objectives and we'll hop into the lecture. So some objectives that we have are that we're going to distinguish between straightforward and staged manipulations of an independent variable. We're going to talk about three different types of dependent variables: the self-report, behavioral, and physiological measures. We're going to talk about the sensitivity of the dependent variable, meaning how do we measure it and what's the likely outcome of the dependent variable based on what we've chosen. And we'll do that by looking at the floor effects and ceiling effects, which you should be familiar with from statistics from way back in Chapter 1. We're also going to describe the ways to control participant expectations and the experimenter expectations. We're going to look at some reasons for conducting pilot studies and then talk about the advantages of including a manipulation check in an experiment. So let's hop into this. A lot of hopping and jumping so far. I better stop that. So when we're talking about experiments, we need to talk about how do we get people engaged in our experiment. We've talked about sampling before when we're looking at their survey design chapter, so I'm not going to talk much about that, but we will use probability or non-probability sampling depending on what you need to do. Probability sampling is working toward the gold standard for experimental design, but there are some cases where we use non-probability sampling because we want to know if there is a difference between groups who have existing conditions. Like if we want to look at this between men and women, for example, that's a existing condition. We can't randomly assign people to one of those conditions and have a meaningful experiment. So we also want to sample in such a way that external validity is intact as much as we can so that we can generalize to other populations. So that means that we want to sample people who we can generalize to. For example, if we wanted to do an experiment with college students, but we wanted to generalize it to people in general, then we wouldn't do a good job because college students are characteristically different than people in general. Not because we're weird or anything, but just because the people who go to college are characteristically different than those who don't generally. So we want to make sure that we can generalize our findings by using good sampling procedures. And again, the larger the sample, the better we're going to be able to arrive at the estimate of the population value. So again, the whole idea of doing research methods is to take a sample of individuals, find out what they're like, and then make some kind of an inference about the population in general. The more people we have, the closer we are to the population, so it means that our findings will be that much more reliable and valid. So in an experiment, we have independent and dependent variables. Independent variables tend to be those variables that we say are going to lead to the outcome or lead to the dependent variable. The way that we present the independent variable can be done using manipulation. And in this case, manipulation is not a bad thing. Manipulation is a way that we control the independent variable so that we can test the differences in some kind of condition. There are two types of manipulations. There's a straightforward manipulation where we use instructions or something to manipulate the independent variable. And then there's a staged manipulation where we try to create some kind of psychological state that simulates a real world situation. Lots of times we'll use a confederate or an accomplice to achieve that. So an example of a straightforward manipulation might be having two groups of people that are going to teach their children to tie their shoes using two different methods. One will be a method where they start at step one and go all the way through the end step to where they tighten up their laces. And then the other group will kind of start at the end. So they'll tie their shoes for the child most of the way and then have the child finish it. And they will stop at an earlier step, and then eventually the child will be able to tie their own shoes. That's a very straightforward manipulation. All I'm doing is having two groups, giving them a set of instructions, and they are conducting some kind of intervention. In this case, it's shoe tying. It's an experimental condition, and I'm going to see how long it takes them to tie their shoes. It's just a very straightforward manipulation. A staged manipulation, on the other hand, would be something where there is something that is concealed. So we use a confederate sometimes. So let's say that we're in a classroom, and it's the first day of class. And we want the students to feel scared of the instructor. No matter what the instructor says, the students will be scared of the instructor. So what you do is you have a classroom of 10 people, and one of the people in the classroom is a Confederate. And they come into class early, they sit down, and they're telling everybody how awful the instructor is and how mean they are. They've had them before, and they didn't even pass the class, and everything was just really awful. So now the students are afraid of the instructor. The instructor comes in, and they're really happy and nice and, like me. And all of a sudden, the students behave as if they're afraid. That's because they are going along with the staged manipulation. The stage manipulation is designed to try to create a psychological state in the participants that might be in a real-world situation. You can't really institute that kind of response or that state of that psychological state unless you have that person in there who is a seed in order to create it. So there are some strengths of the manipulations, especially the stage manipulation, is that there is some external validity of the study. So people behave like they would in the natural setting if they don't know that there is a manipulation. We'll talk about a manipulation check in a little bit. And the other is ethics. And the idea of ethics is that there is something that is being concealed from the participants. We call that deception, and there's an ethical issue behind that. You can use deception again, but again, we have talked about risk and rewards. Let's look at the results or a demonstration of the Asch conformity experiment. Pardon me. The Asch conformity experiment was a very interesting experiment. There was one person who was in the study, and there were several other people who were all Confederates. And what the results of the study were that people would agree with other people. They would conform with the popular opinion, even if it went against what they believed themselves. So here's how the experiment worked. In this experiment, we have a standard size line. So everybody would look at this line, and then one at a time, everybody would say which of these other three lines this first standard line looked like. So they wanted to say which of the comparison lines is most closely to the same length, is closest to the same length as the standard line. And the obvious choice is 2. But the person in the study was the last person to give their answer. So they'd all sit down in chairs, and each person would give an answer, and they'd all say 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. And much of the time in the study, the participant who was not part of the manipulation would say, well, it must be 3, even though they knew it was number 2. Afterwards, the experimenters asked why they said line number 3, even though they knew it was number 2, and they said, well, I didn't want to go against what they thought. I knew that it was 3, but I didn't want to seem contradictory. So people would, this is kind of a learning experience too, plus a research methodology, so it's a double whammy. So people learned that people conformed even when that went against what they believed to be true, but also that the use of these Confederates was very effective in this experiment. So this is called the Asch line judgment task. We could replicate that sometime. That'd be really fun. But think of all the implications for that too. We're not getting into that. Okay. So when we think of a manipulation, we have to think of how strong the manipulation is. Okay, how likely the manipulation is to cause a difference. The idea of the strength of the manipulation, you can read the text, but the idea of the strength of the manipulation is to use the strongest possible manipulation that would occur in the real world without it being too obvious or staged. The idea of the manipulation is to create the most amount of difference in whatever you're measuring. If you're measuring 2 groups, you'll give one group a manipulation, the other one you won't give any. And the stronger the manipulation is, without it being absurd, the better off you are. And it needs to be to the point of ethics as well. So we way back in chapter 3, we talked about the Milgram experiment and how that manipulation was way out of bounds. There was a staged manipulation, and it was out of the bounds of ethics. It was probably too strong. They felt like they needed to be that strong, but it's probably too strong altogether. So think of the maximum amount of manipulation that you can introduce into a study and still get the effect that you need. So let's talk about measuring the dependent variable. So if the independent variable is the thing that is said to lead to a change in the outcome, we can measure the outcome in several ways. So measuring the dependent variable, we can use self-reports, which are used to measure aspects of human thought and behavior. So we could ask somebody, how are you doing today? And they would tell you how they're doing today. And that would be a very simple example of a self-report. Another self-report would be something like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like the KC food? That's a self-report. It's kind of self-explanatory. Don't want to belabor that point. Behavioral measures are observations of behavior. So if I asked you a question like, how much do you like the KC food? You would say, oh, I don't know, maybe a 7, or maybe a 2, or maybe a 10. I don't know how much you like it. I'm a fan, so I'll say an 8. It's pretty good. Yeah, don't judge me. The behavioral measure would be something like, how many times a week do you go to the KC? Well, you might say, well, I have a 21, or what is it, a 19, I guess, 19 meal a week meal plan, so I go 19 times a week. Or maybe it's only 5 because you're not a fan of it. So you could measure that same question behaviorally. You could, instead of saying, how much do you like it, you could measure how much somebody likes it by how many times they go. Now, obviously, some people don't go because either they have class at the wrong time or they have sports practice or whatever, whatever it is, they may not go. But the behavioral measure is a direct observation of a frequency or an intensity or a magnitude of something. A physiological measure is something that we more or less don't control in our bodies but can be measured. So there are several examples of this. Let's say that I wanted to ask you how much you like the KC food. And we went to the KC and I had you hooked up to a GSR, a galvanic skin response measurement, which is kind of what they use in a polygraph test among some others. There's also an electromyogram, by the way. But a galvanic skin response measures the moisture in your skin. So if you have a particular response that is stimulating, usually it could be negatively stimulating, like you could have a fear response that would cause galvanic skin response, so sweating. So can positive stimulation, something like having your plate of your favorite food put down in front of you. So if we used that measurement to see how much you liked KC food, we could measure that physiologically. We could also use an EMG to see how your heart rate changes based on how much you like the food that's put down in front of you. We could use an electroencephalogram too if we could measure the part of the brain that is responsible for food sensation. We could also use an MRI as a way to look at a picture of your brain when you see the food that you like. We could use a functional MRI to see what the pictures of your brain look like, kind of like a video as you're eating. Do the sections of your brain highlight that are responsible for taste receptors and things like that, or are you having a fluctuation of oxytocin, feel-good chemicals from eating the food that you like? So the physiological measure is measuring literally the physiological responses that your body have when you're being recorded doing something, generally for the sake of psychological research. We could use something like biofeedback, which is about it's about electrical conductivity. So if we wanted to do biofeedback, we could use biofeedback for put it on your chest to see how much your heart rate changes based on a certain situation. We could put a monitor on your finger to see how your heart rate changes based on some kind of other stimulus. Maybe it's about managing anxiety or something. So the physiological measures are responsible for the way that that your body creates signals that we can measure. Now, when we're measuring the dependent variable, we have to watch out for a couple of ideas, and we're just going to basically talk about these and define them because they're part of the book and part of the chapter. But we've also talked about these in stats class, so we're going to leave it with that. But sensitivity dependent variable suffers from two ideas. One is the ceiling effect and one is the floor effect. The ceiling effect is when a lot of the scores are at the maximum for the scale. And usually because the possibility of getting positive answers is very likely. If I asked you a question like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how awesome is Professor Haggerty, I would have so many people saying like 9s and 10s, and nobody would say an 8 or lower, that the histogram or the distribution of the scores would be so close to the top that it would almost be meaningless. We'd have to figure out a different way to ask a question so that we could get data that was more spread out. Because if we have all the data points that fall on a certain value, then it's not a very meaningful measure, probably. Same thing with the floor effect. If we looked at the floor effect, the same thing happens, to where if many scores are piled toward the bottom, generally what happens is that there is a measurement that is too difficult or is unlikely to get positive responses. We need to adjust what we're measuring or how we're measuring it so that we get responses that have a mean that is not so far toward the bottom of the scale. In some experiments, we want to keep the purpose of the experiment from the knowledge of the participants. What happens if the participants know what the study is about is that they engage in what we call demand characteristics. Demand characteristics are when the participants think they know what we're trying to do, so they respond in a way that favors our outcome. We can mitigate that using deception, or if it's a survey or a questionnaire, we can use what are called filler items. We can throw them off the track by asking questions that are unrelated to what our research is about. The other thing we can do is use a placebo group. We can use a control group to see if people will have the same outcome if there is no treatment done to them. A very concrete example of this might be something with medication trials. If we want to know if a medication has an impact, let's say we have a medication that cures headaches, and we give 20 people the drug that's supposed to cure headaches, and we give 20 people a pill that does nothing for headaches. If the group that was given the pill for curing headaches all have their headaches go away, and nobody from the placebo group has their headaches go away, then we know that there is no placebo effect, meaning that nobody had a headache go away just because they thought that they were taking the pill. Now, if some people from the placebo group have a headache that goes away, even though they were given a pill that was not supposed to make a headache go away, then we think that there might be a placebo effect, meaning that just knowledge of or thinking that they have a medication that makes a headache go away makes a headache go away. Now, that usually doesn't happen that way because headaches are just not fickle like that, but the example is made more concrete that way. However, we do know that there are some characteristics of psychology that allow us to control our physiological state using a mental state. We know this through something like mindfulness, where we're able to reduce anxiety using thought processes and things like that. So we do know that's possible, but generally headaches don't go away just because you wish them to go away. Boy, or else everybody wouldn't have any headaches. Another type of additional control that we have to consider is what we call experimenter bias or expectancy effects. If an experimenter knows that a participant is part of a treatment group, they may treat that participant differently. And the participant can pick up on that. Very subtle cues. It's not that they're, nice to them because they want their hypothesis to be correct. It's really because if we know somebody's in a treatment group, we will unconsciously do things differently. And I mean unconsciously, where we can't control it. No matter how good you are at something, you cannot control something that's unconscious. Otherwise, it'd be conscious, right? So the expectancy effects are things that we have to watch out for, because if somebody expects they're in a part of a treatment group, or if the experimenter expects that somebody is part of a treatment group, they will treat them differently, or the participant will behave differently. Some solutions that we have are called single-blind experiments and double-blind experiments. You've probably heard of these before. A single-blind experiment is where the participant is unaware that they are in a treatment group. They don't, or what group they're in at all. Now, in the double-blind experiment, which we consider to be the gold standard for psychological research, as far as experimental designs go, in the double-blind experiment, neither the participant nor the experimenter knows which group they belong to. So there is no reasonable way for the expectancy effect to take place if nobody knows what group they belong to. Now, just some final planning considerations when we're talking about conducting research. is that we use pilot studies. A pilot study is when we take a small group of people and have them complete the entire study to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Sometimes when we go through a study and, excuse me, and we do a pilot study, we'll notice that, boy, the instructions aren't very clear, which could have a negative outcome. Or, oh, we didn't give everybody the treatment at the exact same time, and that led to an impact in our study. So a pilot study will help us run through the practical aspects of doing the study to determine if there's something we need to change. The other thing we need to consider when planning a study is called a manipulation check. So we can we can measure the effect of the independent variable manipulation, and a very simple way of doing that is by asking the individuals, hey, did you know that we were doing this? Did you know that this person was a Confederate in the classroom who was saying bad things about the instructor? We can ask people those questions, and it can help us determine if there was a manipulation that people were aware of. The debriefing session is when we would do this. The debriefing session is what we can do to check for manipulations, and also to ask people questions about the study that they were in terms of the pilot study, to determine if there is something that needs to be changed. After we've gotten our results, we can conduct a statistical analysis of the data, we can examine and interpret the pattern of results, and we can determine if there is a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So that's the last step in doing research. So after we've done all of our legwork to set up the research, we conduct our study, we test our independent and dependent variables, and then we analyze the results as much as we can using the method that we've selected. And we're talking about experimental design, so we're probably going to use statistical analysis of the data. After we've done that, then we can submit our results and communicate our research to the body that we are among. And we do that hopefully through a journal article, hopefully through a peer-reviewed article if you are able to get into one, knowing that 90% of the papers that are submitted to some of the more prestigious journals are rejected. There are a lot of people that want to get into these journals, and they select research based on how interesting it is and how different it is and what the results were. So lots of times research doesn't make it to publication. That doesn't mean that it still can't be published more informally through trade articles and trade magazines and things like that. So that is the chapter on conducting experiments. It's important that you are able to understand some of these things, because not in order to conduct an experiment, but because it's good to know the differences in what we consider when we're doing different types of experiments compared to quasi-experiments, et cetera, et cetera. So this chapter should be a good way for you to start to develop a sense of comparative research methodology. God, that sounds boring. But it should be a good way for you to understand why we do what we do. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you can do with this on the article response.